In the winter of 1429, Joan of Arc rode through the frozen gates of Orleans, past walls pockmarked by English cannons, and into a city that had nearly resigned itself to surrender. She was 19, untested, and plainly dressed, yet the soldiers, who only days before had been debating how best to flee, began repairing the barricades, and within weeks, the siege was broken, and the city, once thought lost, was back in French hands. Her arrival did not change the war overnight, but it reminded everyone that sovereignty is not claimed with words. It is held by those willing to stand where others have already withdrawn. And that is how France fights when it remembers itself. This month, France quietly opened the gates to a different kind of fortress, not stone and cannon, but cables and antennas, set into the heart of Toulouse, a base for the defense of its place in orbit. Today, we will look at what this new military space base really is, why it matters far beyond French borders, and what it tells us about how to build sovereignty where others only hold ceremonies. Let's begin. Hello, I'm Gene Botkin with Elenarda, and before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep covering what actually matters, and it tells the algorithm that you prefer substance over noise. Now, the ceremony in Toulouse this July was understated. A handful of officials stood in the Place du Capitole, cut a ribbon, and posed briefly for photos. Then they quietly opened the gates of Air Base 101, now rebranded as the Base Aérienne à Vocation Spéciale, and went back to work. No parades and no music. The French have learned that sovereignty announced too loudly is often sovereignty never tested. What makes this space worth paying attention to is not its size or spectacle, but its function. France has now consolidated its military space command in one location with about 500 officers and specialists. Alongside NATO's own Space Center of Excellence, the base houses the Space Command headquarters, its Space Intelligence Center, and the operational units responsible for monitoring and protecting satellites, as well as a squadron specifically tasked with space control. That term, as dry as it sounds, is a polite way of describing the ability to interfere with hostile satellites or to respond when yours are threatened. The location was not chosen on a whim. Toulouse already contains France's most concentrated aerospace and satellite expertise. CNS, Airbus, and dozens of research institutions already fill the city. And by situating the military base here, France avoided building an isolated outpost and instead embedded its defense into a living ecosystem of engineers, policymakers, and manufacturers. What they opened in July is not a monument, it is an operating facility. It exists to ensure that France has real capability when capability is needed, not merely press statements when threats arise. This was not a gesture toward prestige, but a step toward orbital permanence. And the fact that it came without theatrics suggests that France, for once, intends to be taken seriously. The quiet opening in Toulouse was not merely an exercise in prudence, it was a response to a specific memory that still irritates French defense circles. In 2017, a Russian satellite called Luch Olympe drifted uncomfortably close to the Franco-Italian Athena Fides military communications satellite. Engineers and officers watched as it loitered there, far too close for comfort, and unable to do much beyond notify Moscow and issue statements. The Russians dismissed concerns, calling it routine orbital adjustment, but the French knew better. That moment marked a turning point. It was clear that their civil space program, as strong as it was, offered no shield against military gamesmanship. The Athena Fides incident revealed how vulnerable France remained in orbit and how little recourse it had. Watching someone else toy with your satellites while you stand on the ground and fume is a useful way to clarify priorities, and Toulouse is France's answer. The base consolidates not only their operational command, but also the capacity to observe, interpret, and respond to provocations. Since 2017, France has been rewriting its doctrine to focus on active defense, the ability to detect threats early and to respond with countermeasures if required. Those countermeasures are not theoretical anymore. There is a certain restraint in how France has carried all of this out. No triumphal branding and no loud threats. They named the base after General Robert Aubigné, a man better known for his competence than his flair. And they put it in a city that already knows how to build satellites. They spoke very little about what the base is capable of doing, which tells you almost everything you need to know. That embarrassment in 2017 has been turned into an institutional habit of preparedness. The base in Toulouse stands as the physical proof that France now intends to meet any future incidents with more than words. That institutional habit of preparedness is built not only on doctrine, but also on geography. Toulouse was not chosen out of sentimentality or convenience. It was chosen because it already functions as the gravitational center of European aerospace. And France understands that you do not scatter your best people if you can help it. The city is home to CNES, Airbus, and a dense cluster of satellite manufacturers, engineers, and research centers. The workforce already speaks the language of orbits and payloads. By placing the base here, France avoided the temptation to build some isolated garrison in the countryside where staff would have to be shipped in and trained from scratch. Instead, the officers walk out of the gate into a city where students actively study aeronautics, where civilian engineers discuss satellite buses over lunch, and where contractors and policymakers already circulate. The decision also signals a deliberate philosophy. France treats space not as a separate theater, but as an extension of its existing expertise. By integrating the base into Toulouse's living ecosystem, the French military benefits from civilian knowledge and the natural feedback of a thriving industry. When the same streets carry both soldiers and engineers, information does not need a formal memo to move. There is also a quiet confidence in putting a military facility so close to civilian eyes. Some countries would rather hide their capabilities, building anonymous buildings in deserts or mountains, but France did the opposite. It planted its flag where everyone can see it, signaling that military and civilian space are not rivals, but part of the same ambition. So Toulouse makes the base more than an outpost. It makes it a node, a place where competence, policy, and industry meet without ceremony. And from here, France can move from decision to execution without delay. This kind of integration is not glorious, but it works. The choice of Toulouse also reflects something deeper about how France thinks about sovereignty. The base is not an attempt to match the United States or China in scale. It is not a fantasy of dominating orbit. It is a disciplined statement that France will no longer depend entirely on others to secure its own satellites or signals. For decades, French policy towards space was mostly aspirational. The Athena incident punctured that illusion. Since then, the question has not been whether France could become a superpower in space. We already know the answer to that. But how to ensure that no one can interfere with French assets without facing consequences. The base gives them a place to exercise that kind of sovereignty, not by holding parades or issuing threats, but by keeping watch, writing doctrine, and training officers to respond. It is telling that the doctrine now explicitly includes active defense. That phrase covers a range of countermeasures, from electronic jamming to physical interference, none of which require matching an adversary ship for ship or satellite for satellite. France also appears to have learned not to confuse pride with recklessness. You can see it in the understated way the base was unveiled, in the lack of loud rhetoric about supremacy, in the decision to focus on readiness rather than spectacle. Sovereignty here does not mean controlling everything. It means having enough control to act when necessary and enough competence that others take that possibility seriously. This is why the base matters. It shows that sovereignty in the modern world is not a declaration that you make once and forget. It is a practice, and France is now practicing it where it counts. The base in Toulouse offers a lesson that reaches far beyond France or even space. It shows what governance looks like when stripped of theatrics. It shows that sovereignty is not a posture or a word on a banner, but a set of institutions, staffed and funded, that outlast the people who cut the ribbon. What France has built is modest in size, but coherent. They did not wait for a perfect political moment or for others to clear a path. They identified a gap, set an achievable goal, and carried it out without pretending to do more than they could, and that is why it will work. You can feel the difference between a base that was built to impress and one that was built to function. What also stands out is the absence of unnecessary abstraction. The French did not try to solve space security in the broadest sense, nor did they indulge in vague talk of global leadership. They concentrated on their own satellites, their own command, their own capacity to act when pressed, and that clarity spared them the paralysis that comes when a country convinces itself that everything must be addressed at once. Governance at its best means building what you can now so that more is possible later. The base in Toulouse is not a triumph, but it is a foundation, and that is why it deserves attention. When others still confuse headlines with achievements, France has chosen to invest in permanence, and permanence is harder to fake. If others wish to follow, then they would do well to copy the habit rather than the language. Build first, announce later. France has quietly reminded everyone that this still works. The Toulouse base is not the end of France's adjustment to the orbital realities. It is only the beginning. The base opened with 500 personnel, but its capacity is expected to grow. New missions will be added. More officers will be trained. Hardware will be upgraded. All of this will happen without much public fanfare, which seems to have become a deliberate part of the strategy. France has now given itself a place where its space policy can be lived rather than drafted. That matters, because the threats will not wait politely for budgets or headlines. The next Russian satellite maneuver, the next Chinese signal jamming, or even an accidental collision will test not what France has promised, but what it has already built. And this time, they will have something to point to beyond a press release. The quiet nature of the base is also a signal to allies and rivals. France does not plan to challenge the United States in scale, nor does it seem eager to join the chorus of countries making grand claims about their orbital dominance. Instead, it is preparing to protect its own and to take part in NATO operations from a position of real competence. And that level of seriousness is difficult to ignore. What comes next is steady work, more drills, more doctrine, and more officers learning how to respond to the things that don't, and more officers learning how to respond to the things that most people on Earth still don't notice. That kind of patience tends to pay off when the inevitable test arrives. And that kind of patience tends to pay off when the inevitable test arrives. France has made it clear it no longer intends to improvise when that moment comes. It intends to be ready, and readiness is hard to fake. The base in Toulouse does not look like much. It could pass for a regional tax office if you didn't notice the antennas, but that is exactly the point. France has no interest in impressing tourists with launch pads and banners. They built something that works, which is exotic enough these days. What they have done here is both modest and subversive. Instead of issuing a grand strategy document and calling it a day, they put real people in real buildings with real tasks. It is almost impolite how little they cared about staging it for the cameras. You can tell a lot about a country by how it defends itself. France, at least here, chose to skip the theater and move straight to the part where things actually get done. There's something almost indecent about it. If you appreciate watching governments do something, and if you appreciate watching governments do something that makes sense, a rare enough spectacle, then like this video and subscribe to the channel. We'll be here to document the next quiet, improbable display of space-based competence. With Elenarda, I'm Gene Botkin. End transmission.